All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another Bates Botanical Boot Camp. We appreciate you watching these. We're putting out some information for you. Hopefully that's helpful. And today our topic is ketchup on tomatoes. What a clever name Tyler came up with. He's awesome at doing those. So hence the name of ketchup on tomatoes. We're going to be catching up on them. I'm not going to be speaking on, say, purchasing them, planting them, small plants, getting them going, all that. We're going to pretty much assume that your plants are already in the ground and growing, and we're just going to catch up on them. We're going to see what we need to be doing, some issues you might be having, some pruning strategies, some pest and disease stuff. So there's a number of things to talk about, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. And so if you've never grown tomatoes, this will be a good thing for you. And if you have grown them, this is still good because every year you get to kind of remember how vigorous tomatoes can be. At this stage in the game, you've probably already had yours planted. They've been growing for multiple weeks, and you're starting to notice, okay, they're getting pretty large. That's what tomatoes do. So one of the first things we need to talk about is how do we get them up and off the ground? That's one of our biggest concerns when we talk about growing tomatoes and getting issues with, say, pests or disease. And that's going to be, keeping a plant, on really close to the ground and not staked up properly. So there is a whole slew of ways to prop up tomatoes. There's not one way that's necessarily better than the others. The biggest key is that we need to get them off the ground and up and supported on something that's sturdy enough to hold up not only just the stems and all the leaves, but whenever the fruit starts to come on, to be able to hold those limbs up so the fruit doesn't literally weigh the plant down and then have it flop on you. So one of the most common ways to deal with this issue is to use tomato cages, which are readily available here and all sorts of different retailers. And they're nice about keeping the plant tight and kind of together. And a lot of times, though, my issue with tomato cages and why I don't use them personally very often is because tomatoes have a way of outgrowing them. And they also get to where there can be a lot of stems on the inside of this cage that are all limbs and leaves kind of touching each other. It lessens your airflow, and you can see some issues with that. So if you're going to use tomato cages, then I would recommend doing some significant pruning to kind of lessen the amount of stems that you have. And I'm going to get to pruning here in a minute, but that's a good method. Another really tried and true easy method to do, especially if you're just growing a few tomatoes, say 5 or 10 or whatever. You're not growing, say 50 in a row or something. If you're just growing a few in a raised bed, just a simple single stake method. So using a nice tomato stake, which typically is wooden, and they'll be roughly about 6 to 7 feet tall, with a point at the end of them where you can drive them into the ground right next to the plant after you plant them, and literally just tying them up as they get taller. What we do want is for our stems to not get to where they get too heavy, and then what a lot of times what tomatoes will do if you don't get at them and keep them tied up tall, they'll tend to kind of get heavy and flop weird, and then you've got to try to get them back up, and it's a little bit trickier to do that. So as much as we can keep a tie on the actual main stem of the tomato and keep it going in an upward fashion, that's the way to grow them, and you'll see the size on them that'll end up getting pretty big. Another method, which is the method that I use at my house this year, which I change it up every year. I like to just see different methods to use. But a kind of fencing / trellising way to grow them. So say someone like my dad has got, like, say, cattle fencing. It's the fencing that's got like the big square holes in it, that's all this woven wire. And it comes on like a panel type thing. And a lot of times they'll be like 4 foot by 8 foot long. And it's just a very sturdy metal fencing panel. So driving some T-posts, like some metal T-posts you would get from the co-op or TSC, driving them into the ground and then attaching that fence onto those T-posts with wire just to keep it upright, and then planting your tomatoes in a row in front of something like that, and then you can simply tie off individual limbs to that fence post. That's or to the fencing. It's an excellent way to trellis up tomatoes, especially if you have a whole number of them and you're trying to do a whole line. It's really, you get to keep that year after year. That metal doesn't really, it's good about not rusting. It's made for fencing and keeping in cattle, so it's a pretty sturdy option. It's a little expensive right off the bat to get that stuff, but once you've got it, you have it for years and years and years. You never have to get rid of it. You can just store it over the winter and reuse it every year. So definitely a good method for a long-term tomato growing process. And like I said, a little expensive at first, but it pays off down the road. That one's another one. Another one you can use is another simple method, which I'm getting back to what I do this year. And this is a method to where I've got 12 tomatoes is all I really need. And I've got 4 different rows of 3. And what I've done is I put 2 T-posts at the end of the 3. And I run twine down at the base. Whenever I first planted them, I twined them up down at the base. I kind of weave the wire or the line around the tomatoes in a fashion to where I start at one T-post, wind them around all the tomato plants down to the other T-post. Once I get to that one, I wrap it around that T-post and then come back the opposite way and twine them back around the other tomatoes the opposite way. And this creates like a pinch kind of effect on the tomato stem that has an opening, and tie it back off to the other T-post at the end, make sure it's nice and tight. And then as the tomato gets larger, I will do this again and make another line going across the exact same way, and then back opposite the way of itself again. And like I said, I'll keep doing that all the way up. I like this method. It keeps it nice and clean. It keeps it pretty open and airy. I will say at the end of the season, it can be fairly annoying because there's a lot of twine left over. You kind of have to cut and get all the tomatoes off of it, and the cleanup's not very fun. But I do like it. It's a fun method. It also gets you down and makes you really kind of look at your plants and make sure you're, getting the limbs where you want them, and you can just be down on them, so you get to actually see any disease or pest that you might need to clean up later too. So it kind of just gets you working and gets your eyes on the tomatoes, and make sure they're doing what you want. So like I said, the biggest key, though, you can do any kind of method you want. The biggest key is to get them up off the ground as soon as possible and getting them growing up and vertical, which is what we want. That's the growth that we want.
And I'm just going to jump in here and say, if you have any questions about anything about tomatoes, that could be top to bottom, beginning to end, we're here to answer them today.
Mm-hmm.
So
if I say anything that sounds weird or you just really didn't follow it or whatever, need me to re-talk about it, send in your questions and just interrupt me, and I'll answer them. Like Tyler said, anything tomato related, we're here to answer. So feel free. All right, so moving on from staking, we've got our stakes, we got our plants, staked up and looking good. So the next thing we need to talk about is a little bit of pruning. Now, some people, and let me just go ahead and say this, you don't have to prune a tomato whatsoever. You don't. They're vigorous. They're going to grow. They're going to get bushy. They're going to get big without any type of pruning at all. I don't recommend this mainly because tomatoes, specifically in Middle Tennessee, have a whole number of issues they can get. Like I said, disease and pest related. The more leaves and the more stems that you have on a plant makes it tighter. It makes it less open, less airy for airflow, and it also gives a lot more opportunity for pests to settle in just because they've got so many more leaves, especially say insect pests like caterpillars, which are pretty good at hiding, and they can cause a lot of damage really quickly. You can go to work one morning, not notice anything, and then come back, and one single caterpillar can really wreck a whole lot of leaves on a tomato plant. So we want to try to avoid that if we can, and we're going to do this with a little bit of pruning. Now, first things first, what we need to talk about is which tomato you are trying to grow. There are 2 different types of growing tomatoes for the most part, and this is going to be your determinate tomatoes versus your indeterminate tomatoes. And the pruning is actually a little bit different when it comes to those. So starting off first, we'll start with the determinates. The determinates are the ones that have a determined size and fruiting period. They're not going to keep producing fruit all the way till frost. They don't do that. They only get to a certain size. One of the most common determinate types of tomatoes is a Roma. We all probably grow Romas. Most people at least have 1 or 2 in the garden. They're a great paste tomato, really good for spaghetti sauces and things like that. They are a determinate tomato, and what we need to know about determinates is that we are not going to prune them near as severely as we would an indeterminate tomato, and I'll get to that in a second. With determinate tomatoes, you want as many stems and as many flowers as possible. I say this because you only get a certain number of flowers and fruit through the season. So I will say most people think with determinate tomatoes that they say, well, they all come in at once, and this is somewhat true, but Not necessarily. So a determinate tomato will produce all of its fruit at once, but that period is about over a month's time. So all of those smaller tomatoes at the base are certainly going to ripen up quicker than the ones at the top of the plant. But they are all going to ripen at a similar time, like I said, typically over the course of a month. Now, like I said earlier, we do not really want to be doing too much pruning on determinate tomatoes, minus a little bit of just cleanup. So with any tomato you're going to grow, determinate or indeterminate, I really want you to get those lower leaves off the bottom of the plant. Okay, I don't want any of those leaves getting anywhere close to the dirt. Now, you're not going to be able to do this at first when they're young. They're just going to have to kind of get through that. But as they start growing up, getting into, say, 3 to 4 feet tall, let's go down to those lower leaves, and any of those leaves that are even close to the ground or touching the ground at all, we want to go ahead and remove. Now, removal on small little bitty stems is okay to just pinch off with your finger. That's certainly fine practice to do. But if you're starting to get into bigger limbs, I'm just going to show you while I've got this here. If this were a stem that I wanted to cut off, let's see, one of the lower limbs. Okay. Well, either way, it's not hard. It's just a simple snip. But what I like to do, I don't like to go right to the main stem of the plant, like really, really tight to that. I like to leave it and just go a little bit out and leave a little bitty nub right there. That little bitty nub that we leave on there actually helps out with like trellising and stuff. It's a spot that you can kind of put a line onto or something you could connect to, and that'll slowly fall off as it ages, but it keeps it off that main stem to create any wounds, deep wounds on the main stem. So I take that back off just a little bit, and that's how we're going to prune. So
would you mind holding that up to the camera, Austin, where you cut on the tomato?
Where I cut?
Yeah.
Right there. You see that?
Point it to your left. Hold it up to the camera to your left.
See that? See? Yes. Just lift a little nub.
There it is.
So nothing special, nothing fancy. Like I said, I just don't take it to that real tight to that main stem to lessen any wounds. That's all the nutrients and water, everything going up that main stem. So let's try to not create wounds on that if we can help it. So that being said, determinate tomatoes, the ones that produce kind of all at once over a period of a month, they generally stay smaller and a little bit bushier than indeterminate tomatoes do too. So good one to use for cages. For your determinate types, cages are nice to use because you are going to keep most of those main stems. So like I said, determinate tomatoes, great yielder of fruit. I will say that too. The more stems you got, the more fruit you're going to get, especially on the Roma types.
So you're saying tomato cages are better for the bushier determinate type tomatoes?
I think so, because indeterminate tomatoes are vining tomatoes, ones that can really go. They tend to outgrow most of the cages you can buy at stores. They're just simply not tall enough. So that's why I think the cages are nice for the determinate ones, and it keeps all the limbs encaged where you kind of want them, so they're not getting out away from you or anything. They're all kind of in there together.
Well, that explains why I've tried them with indeterminate, and they escape quickly.
They escape. Yeah, it's not worth it. You need a different method for the indeterminates.
Now here's a crazy thing for indeterminate tomatoes. What if you took the tomato and started going around the outside and spiraling up? Has anybody done that?
Tomato cage?
Yeah.
It can be done. The only thing is plants in general, especially tomatoes, they have a real tendency to want to go up. That's just the nature of the beast when it comes to plants for the most part. Everything really wants to grow up. So in theory, Tyler, yes, you could certainly wind it around your cage. That'd be kind of a cool little thing to do. It would almost be ornamental at the end of the season. But it's going to take work, and you kind of have to be out there typically, every 2 or 3 days to get those things pinned to the cage to keep it wrapping horizontally rather than wanting to go vertical. So that'd be cool to try, though. There's a lot of people that run their tomatoes laterally, though. They'll get it with indeterminate tomatoes. They'll have a staking system that gets up too tall, and then they can simply run a wire up above them and then pin the tomato to the top. And then as it gets tall and it wants to flop, you pin it down to the line to make them all go this way.
Yeah.
If you ever get a chance, look up tomatoes at the Epcot Center out in Disney World, I guess, in Orlando. Just look that up and look at some of the images they're doing. Now, they're doing extensive training, and they've got professionals there that are working with these tomatoes, but they literally make like tomato trees, and they trellis them atop of all this wiring system. Like I said, just Google it and look at the image. It is fascinating and really, really cool to see. So definitely can be done. Now, let's move over to indeterminate tomatoes, which I was talking about earlier, which are the vining type of tomatoes. These type of tomatoes are much more vigorous, They get much larger, and they produce fruit until frost if the plant's happy and healthy. And the pruning strategy on indeterminate tomatoes is going to be much different, because we generally, as home growers, aren't set up like Epcot is to have, a massive greenhouse with a whole bunch of stuff above us to tie off to. We just don't have the room or the space or the means of that. So we have to pick and choose kind of which stems we want to keep and which ones we don't. If you do not ever prune an indeterminate tomato, you'll have multiple long stems that are gangly. They like I said earlier, lessen airflow. They create opportunities for pests to enter, and they're honestly just too much. They're too much for us to deal with. And the fruit, a lot of times, if you have way too many stems, the fruit doesn't finish off at that full size that you would want. They tend to be smaller because you have so many. A lot of energy is having to be putting into them fruiting, and they never fill out to that full size, So doing a little bit of pruning on them is what we want to do. Now, I brought in a tomato here to show you first off what a sucker sprout is. And generally with plants, we think of sucker sprouts as sprouts that come from the base of the plant. This happens a lot with, say, crepe myrtle. You've probably noticed you got a tree form up top, and then sucker sprouts come from the dirt, from their root system down below. That's what we generally call suckers in the plant world. Not the case with tomatoes. With sucker sprouts and tomatoes, let me just show you what it is. See if we can get a good shot of right there. There. Okay. So, with an indeterminate tomato, like I said, it's mainly a vine. What we've got here is our single main stem that comes up, the main part of the plant, and then we've got a lateral stem that is right here, which goes straight horizontal. These are kind of the ones that just soak up the sun, and they're the feeders for the rest of the plant. And then in between that angle right there, which is what we call a crotch angle, it's main stem, lateral stem. In between that, you've got this stem right here. This is a sucker sprout. This is going to make a whole new limb, and it's going to create its own flowers, and it's going to create its own fruit eventually if left be. Now, with a small plant like this, and specifically, I guess I'll say how I like to grow tomatoes is not with a single stem the whole way up. You lessen your fruit that way too. You make a nice clean plant, and they get very, very tall if you keep a single stem. But what I like to do is keep about 4 to 5 main stems. And so this means I'm going to keep the main stem, obviously, and then I'm going to keep about 3 to 4 other sucker sprouts that actually start at about this size. I don't really like my suckers coming all the way from the base, because I'm going to go ahead and tell you, I'm going to prune these lower leaves off if they were set out in the garden, because they're going to be too close to the dirt, and you start to get issues. Just like this little yellow leaf right here. I left this in here to show you that lower leaves on tomatoes certainly start to do this. This is a general fact y'all need to know about almost all plants, is that whenever they turn yellow and black and they start getting spots on them, there's no magic cure we can give you or anybody can give you that's going to change that leaf back to pretty green again. Okay, so it's better to just remove it, because that probably is just a leaf spot pathogen that most tomatoes can deal with and handle and get through without issues. But the quicker you get those removed, the less issues you're going to have later. So like I said, we're going to go ahead and prune all these. I'm not going to let any suckers come from down low at the base, but this is a good spot for a sucker to begin. Because I got my main stem kind of going this way. I got a limb that's going to want to go out that way. And that means, and then I'll have more sucker sprouts come from up above that. This is a small plant, so it's kind of hard to envision what a bigger plant's going to be, but it's okay to leave, like I said, about 4 to 5 main stems, and then that's when your trellising starts to come into play, where you can start pinning those limbs farther, nice and spaced out from each other. So like I was telling you about my dad earlier with his cattle fencing approach, this is a nice way to do it, because you can get a main stem and then that's going straight up, and then you can get multiple suckers that go out, and then say to the front, to the back, wherever, and you can pick about 5 of those and tie them directly off to the wire, spaced out in a kind of a fan shape, if you will, to keep as much airflow into that plant as you can. Now, what you're going to see with indeterminate tomatoes and how vigorous they are is that the sucker sprouts that you kept are going to create their own sucker sprouts that are going to want to make more vines and more, just craziness and just too much. So whenever you do see the sucker sprouts that you left and that are looking good start to want to sucker themselves, that's whenever you need to start pulling those suckers off of those other stems. It's just better to just get rid of them and don't worry about it. You can simply just, when it comes to those suckers, you just get in there with your fingers. Or this one's actually, most of the time you can pull suckers with your fingers. This sucker specifically is starting to get pretty chunky. So a lot of times what happens if you try to bend it and break it, it'll just bend, and then it's kind of hard to pull off. So if you want to, just go ahead and just remove with your pruners. But let's just go ahead and take that whole sucker sprout away, and it'll open it up and keep it clean after you've got the stems that you want to keep. After that, when it comes to the like I said, once you got them suckered and you've got the stems you want to keep, they're going to free flower and start free fruiting, and it's all going to be good. Now, they're once again vigorous. Once again, keeping good airflow within the plants is really going to help out with your pests. So any leaves that you see that are going towards the interior of the plant, so any leaves that are touching this way across the tomato plant where they're all bushed up on top of each other, we can go ahead and remove some of those, y'all. Tomatoes produce a ton of leaves, and they really don't need them all to create really nice flowers and fruit. That's almost just too much. So anytime you need to go in and you see your tomatoes just looking really thick and you can't really see through them because there's just so many leaves in there, go ahead and just remove some of those leaves, and let's open it up and let's get some more light, and get some more light, honestly, onto the fruit itself. They ripen up more uniformly, and it's just good to have light on your fruit as well. So keeping those plants open is really the best practice you can do. Don't be scared to prune too much. Really, you can prune a tomato a lot more than you think. So get them open, get them airy, get all that light to the interior of the plant. So that's a little bit about pruning on the two different types of tomatoes. And you can read on your label whenever you buy them. Every single tomato label will tell you if it's indeterminate or determinate. So a little bit of different pruning strategies on each, but both methods will get you the most fruit. So there we go. Let's move on to the next kind of stage, which is we're in that stage right now with tomatoes to where they're certainly growing, they're getting big, and they're starting to set some fruit. It is good practice. I'm sure all of you, if you're like mine at all, you've got fruit set on your tomatoes already. Some are even probably turning for you. There's some cherry tomatoes that are certainly start to ripen up. And if you got them in early enough, you might even have some regular sized tomatoes starting to go. So one little quick tip for you, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but going out to those green fruits whenever they're young, go out to them and flip them up. Just turn them up and look at the bottom sides a little bit of the actual fruit. If it's green and clean and looks good, you're well on your way. It's going to be fine. If you notice a sunken black kind of spotting starting to happen on the bottom, not spotting, one single spot on the bottom, on the butt side of the tomato, if you will, that's a calcium deficiency, and there's a mess up somewhere in your pH. Your pH levels are off, and your plant is not getting enough calcium. This problem is called blossom end rot, and if you've ever grown tomatoes, you've probably seen this before. It's not too uncommon, but you can catch it early. If you do catch it early, you can add what you need to add, which is going to be a calcium supplement. To get those tomatoes, the tomatoes actually can quickly take that nutrient in and then fix that issue before you see more fruits that start getting that issue. So if you check those young fruits on the back sides, like I said, if you see that black spot on there, those fruits are not going to finish very well. You might be able to get a half harvest on them. You have to cut them in half and just eat the top part of the tomato. Well, nobody wants that. We want to get a whole perfect tomato. So like I said, do a check on those. Make sure you're not seeing that. If you're seeing green, you're good. But if we do need to add some stuff, come out here. Let us help you get. There's actually foliar sprays for calcium. There's other added fertilizers that have extra calcium in it. So we're going to get that to them. So that was quick. And then another one, this is the time of year to kind of keep our tomatoes growing. I learned from a grower that I knew long ago that was very, very good at growing plants. And what he told me is, plants can stress and they can bounce back from that, and that's fine. But one of the best things he told me was, but why? We need to keep them growing. So that's kind of has always stuck with me, is to keep them growing. So you do the stuff you need to do beforehand before you start seeing stressful things later. So right now, tomatoes are certainly heavy feeders. They've got an amazing root system to support that plant that's up on top. And they need plenty of nutrients to get to where they need to be. So right now would be a really good time to get them fed, and we can use an organic product. Oh, man. I brought the wrong. Okay.
I was wondering, it's like red bag.
I don't know why. My bad. Yeah. Okay. So this is technically Hollytone. There's a whole batch of these organic fertilizers that have at the end of it tone. And there's a number of them. And what I meant to bring is tomato tone. obviously. I grabbed the Hollytone. They're both red bags. My mistake. But anyway, the difference with Tomato Tone specifically is that Tomato Tone has a fair amount of added calcium to it. So if you do see some blossom end rot, Tyler's stepping out to go get us some actual Tomato Tone. So anyway, if you do see some blossom end rot on those young tomatoes and we need to feed anyway, Tomato Tone is certainly an excellent product to go ahead and put around the base of the plant, mainly around the drip line of the plant. The drip line is where the water falls off the leaves. If it were to be raining outside, say it was raining, where the water drips off the leaves, that goes straight down to where the actual root zone is below that. And that's where we need to fertilize all around the top, work it in the first couple 2 or 3 inches of the soil, and then make sure we water it nice and deeply after that. That's simply all you got to do, but you need to do that typically 2 or 3, right whenever you plant. After about a week or so, usually about 2 weeks, let that young plant kind of latch in. You can tell when it's kind of latched into the earth, not really going anywhere. It's not wiggly anymore in the ground. It's kind of latched in. That's when we need to give our first fertilizer application to them. And then, like I said, right about now, say about a month after you planted them, a month and a half, let's go ahead and reapply that. And Tyler right on cue with some Tomato Tone. So here we go. This is a 346 fertilizer, but it's also got 8% calcium, which is actually fairly high for organics. So really good product to use. It's totally organic. It's got great mycorrhiza, fungi, all good stuff that's going to kind of help out the process. So make sure you get that done, and you'll see a much healthier plant by the end of the season. All right, so we're feeding them. Next thing we need to be catching up on, and that is certainly pests. There's a whole number of pests that really like tomato plants. Specifically,
before we dive too deep,
go ahead
into pests.
Yeah,
we have a question.
What's the question?
Hold on, let me catch my breath. With the heat we are having, what do we do to keep from having sun scald on our tomatoes?
Well, honestly, there's not too much you can do with that. Sun scald does happen sometimes, but honestly, it's pretty rare. Now, I worked at MTSU's organic vegetable farm for a number of years when I was in college, and one of our favorite things to grow was tomatoes. And I did a little experiment. I was in school, so we're always kind of experimenting. I did 4 different ways of trellising, and all in the same garden, and we were growing hundreds of tomatoes, so this was the whole thing. One of my rows that I did was that I chose to do an indeterminate planting, so vining type tomatoes, with a single stem system. I pruned every single sucker that ever even tried to be. All I was left with was one main vine, dead center, working all the way up onto a trellis system up top. They got floppy. It was a whole thing. By the end of the season, y'all, these tomatoes were 17 feet tall. Like I said, I didn't allow them to bush at all. One single stem, 17 feet long. That's what I was able to grow. What you're going to see whenever you do that is that you've got a ton of open space and not a lot of leaves. What this means is that all the fruit is going to be fully exposed to the sunlight. And I never, hardly at all, saw a problem with any type of sun scald. It almost seemed like tomatoes actually preferred to have that sun on their fruit to help ripen them up. There was the random occasion to where that one fruit could be sitting in that one spot that's just getting this horrible reflective heat, and it could turn it a little bit whitish on the top a little bit. Like I said, I saw that issue a little bit, but honestly, I did not see it that bad. So I grow my tomatoes very similar now with just a few main stems, and all of my fruit is wide open, exposed to that sunlight. So if I really just haven't seen much issues with that. So it is unusually hot for this time of year, but not much we can do about that. We can't really turn down the weather, and the tomatoes need a full sun environment. So we're just going to kind of have to deal with that. It is what it is. But like I said, I usually don't see that issue.
I also picked up a tip online. A grower of tomatoes didn't prune as much on his tomatoes, and he created a bushier, leafier top canopy to kind of protect the fruit and what's growing beneath. Mm-hmm. So, might be good to just leave, especially with determinate tomatoes, just leave it be. And let
you certainly probably wouldn't have that issue with determinates because of that leaf habit. But like I said, even with indeterminates, I don't see much of an issue with that. So anyway, all right, good question though.
Pests.
Pest, back to pest. We got to check for pest, people. Biggest thing, no matter what you're growing. Ornamentally, spend a lot of money on your landscape, and you want to keep it looking good. You planted your vegetable garden, you want to keep your, looking good, and you want to eat fruit. So we got to keep the pests out of there because they can really be a nuisance. How do we do this? Look at your plants. You really need to observe and go out and look at your garden every day. I've got this big old tree that sits way far away from the garden, but whenever I get home from work and I'm sitting there, it takes a while, but the sun gets behind that tree and it will eventually shade the whole garden. At that point, that's whenever I take my nightly walk outside and look at all the plants and just make sure I'm not seeing anything crazy going on. You're going to see damage on a plant before you're actually going to see the pest almost 95% of the time. Okay, so that's why I take my walk out in the garden every night. I got a whole bunch of squash and zucchini, and really I've got it all. And you can make a walk through the garden and see holes in leaves that you may not have seen the day before. In this case, you've certainly got something, okay? It's going to be some sort of insect pest that is in there. Whether you see it or not, you saw the damage, and the damage that wasn't there previously. So go to that leaf, flip it over on the back side, and you'll usually find some sort of caterpillar or worm or maybe a type of beetle that's kind of affecting this. Anytime you can hand pick off early issues, that's your best bet. Now, if you don't do anything and you come out the next day and you see twice as many holes, you don't do anything, you come back out the next day, you see about 10 times the amount of holes. That's how pests kind of work. They start off kind of minimal damage, and then numbers start to grow. Say an egg colony is hatched, and then you went from 2 worms to 20, then they can really do some damage quickly. So that's why every day we really need to go out and make our walk through our gardens and just look at them. If a spray is needed, which is not fun, nobody likes to spray. I can't stand it, and I like to keep mostly organic products in my garden if I can help it. It's not always the case. Sometimes if you have a really bad outbreak on stuff, you have to use something a little bit more stout. Now, do know the biggest pollinator of all of our gardens are going to be bees. What do bees go to? Flowers. Anytime you're spraying synthetic chemicals on plants that are in flower where you have bees, you're going to have less bees because you're going to mess up their colony. They can't take insecticides. We've all heard about Save the Bees and the movement that's going on, and we're trying to get better at it, and we all need to be better with our home gardens. So being as organic as you can and plucking off pests and observing them first and finding them and getting rid of them quickly is going to be your best control of not having to worry about killing bees later on in the season, because they're the ones that are giving us our fruit. So there you go. There's a whole number, like I said, of pests to look out for on tomatoes specifically. I'm not going to get into all of them because there's simply too many, but mainly caterpillars. Tomato hornworm seems to be one of the biggest you have to watch out for because of how quickly it can take a plant. They are very, very quick eaters. They get fat very quickly. And when I say tomato hornworm, it's a big, fat, green worm that can get very large, but they're called hornworms. Got this very pronounced horn on the back side of them. It's kind of a little protection, I guess. It's an evolutionary trait they've got. But like I said, one day you go to work and you come home and they can almost take a plant, especially if it's young. So we need to keep an eye on those, and they're very good at hiding, y'all. They lay kind of on the main stem. They kind of blend themselves in with a stem, and then they munch on the leaves a little bit. So just get in there and look at them. Like I said, look for damage first. Look at all your leaves. Look and see if you have chew marks, bite marks, whatever, leaves that are literally missing. That's when you need to get in there, find that worm. Another really good thing to look for whenever you are looking for worms is, for lack of a better word, their poop that's left behind. So they eat a lot, so they also let loose of that a lot. And this is in the form of little black green almost balls, if you will. They're real small, but they congregate on lower leaves. So if you ever see lower little black balls kind of on the lower leaves of the tomato plant, simply go up to the next branch and you'll probably find a worm up there that's just munching down on your tomatoes. So that one causes a lot of damage quickly. That's why I wanted to mention it. Certainly a number of other pests, say aphids. Aphids are really a nuisance when it comes to young tomato plants. They don't actually do too much damage to the plant, to be honest with you. Anytime you have small little aphid colonies, literally just rubbing them off, just killing them with your fingers is totally fine. Or if you have a good ladybug colony, ladybugs really like to eat aphids. So getting the good bugs mixed in with the bad bugs, it's not always awesome practice to just get rid of every single bad pest there is, because then there won't be any good ones that come in to help you out on bad years. So leaving a little aphid colony sometimes on a, say, side stem or something that's not really affecting the overall health of your tomato plant, to leaving those on there maybe and getting some ladybugs that'll come in and start feasting on those, and that'll grow your ladybug population, and you'll have a healthier garden as the years go on, because you'll start to see the ladybugs overwinter their eggs and then them hatch in the spring and create this whole little thing where they work together, you know. It's really nice to get all that going together. Okay, other than that, right now, the one thing I'm noticing is cucumber beetle. Cucumber beetle can be a little bit of a problem. Once again, rarely is detrimental to the plant, but can certainly cause holes in the leaves, and it'll make it look unsightly. Cucumber beetles are little, small. They look a lot like ladybugs, except for they're yellow with little black spots all over their back. I'm sure you've probably seen these. And beetles are a little bit trickier to kill with say, organic sprays. They have a hard exoskeleton, so it's hard to kind of coat those insects with the oils or the soaps that you typically use for organic measures. So you have to use a little bit of stouter chemicals to get rid of those cucumber beetles. But like I said, if you can just stomp on them or squish them, or I got a really powerful flick. I've been working on it for years. So anytime you can flick off those beetles, that's a really good way to kill them. I'm sure you've noticed Japanese beetles have come on stage. They are here. They're an exotic invasive species that's not even supposed to be here, but they've certainly landed, and they can do a great deal of damage on tomatoes pretty quickly. They congregate generally on the top of the plant, and they tend to want to do their most damage during the deadest, hottest part of the day. So I know that's not fun for us to get out and work in our garden or whatever, but if you can take a stroll in the midday timing where the Japanese beetles are really around right now, go out to those plants and you'll see them nestled in the top just munching away. Give them a nice flick and just get rid of those as quick as you can, because you do not want to see a real bad outbreak on those. So those are just a number of pests that can get you. But like I said, biggest key on pests, no matter what we're talking about, is going to be observance. Look at those things. Give them your eyes. Give them some attention every day so we can really get some bountiful fruit at the end of the season. Okay, so there we go with the pest. Do all that. And then I guess kind of concluding here, getting to the end, don't be... this is kind of more early stages, I guess, but we're kind of middle to early stages now. So, but still, I want to let y'all know that sometimes Mother Nature can do things that change what we do, and that's where the observance once again comes in. And this is more on a, say, disease issue. Sometimes, and almost all the time actually, you're going to see lower leaves on a tomato go yellow, like I mentioned earlier, go yellow or black or get spotty. Anytime you remove those and get rid of them, you lessen a problem later. This is good practice to just do this. Just clean cut those leaves, get them far away from the garden, throw them in the woods, throw them in a trash bag. We don't want them laying around the bottom of the plant because that'll spread stuff as well. Be nice and clean and be tidy as much as you can with your plants, removing those leaves. But unfortunately, sometimes you can see odd spotting, wilting, weird black spots amongst the top of the plant, more or less working itself down. This could be caused by a number of different pathogens, but mainly early and late blight. We've all heard the term blight. It can really affect a whole number of plants, and it's hard to treat. And it's hard to actually get rid of once you kind of got it. So when we're at this stage of development, looking at your plants and determining if there's one that just has, since you planted it, looked bad, or it just looks off, it looks spotting, it doesn't look like it's vigorous, sometimes it's best to cut your losses. That's why you plant multiple tomatoes to kind of deal with that. But if you have that issue in the garden, you're going to see that persist a lot of times year after year. If you leave that there and just let all those fungal spores finish up and do what they do, and then throw out millions more spores for that issue to potentially happen next year, and you have multiple seasons of having to deal with this, instead of just literally taking that plant and removing it immediately, putting it in a bag, and getting it away from the rest of those plants, and then probably even digging up maybe just a scoop or two of the soil that it was in and removing that as well to just keep it clean. If you have to lose a plant because of that, it's way better to lose one plant early in the season or two plants early in the season than to affect your whole crop later on in the season. So if you only have one tomato and this happens to you, I'm sorry, and there could be some treatment options, and there are some treatment options to try to turn it around. But sometimes it's best, especially if you catch it early enough, to where you can just remove that plant and then come out and get a new one and retry again, because it happens. It happens to the best of us. I've been growing tomatoes for years, and I literally, like I said, I had 12 tomatoes. I came home the other night. Me and my wife were out looking in the garden. Our kids were out playing in the yard. It's what we do. And I noticed one of my tomato plants. This is me. I've been doing this forever. One of my tomato plants has a little stem at the very top of it that was wilting. And the rest of the plant looked fantastic. No spotting. I actually have a really disease-free garden this year. It's really nice. This hot weather has come on, and it's kind of done some stuff in the plant world that we don't necessarily like, but what it also has done is kind of lessened our disease. Disease mainly happens when we're in those kind of late spring time, to where we're like warm but also moist and muggy and nasty, that kind of Tennessee weather. We've been so hot that a lot of the fungal pathogens haven't been near as bad this year. So tomatoes have been really clean, which is nice and helpful. But I noticed that one stem at the top was turned down and wilting. And I thought, that's odd, because if a plant's water stress, wilting is certainly a cause of water stress. That's almost always the go-to. But the rest of my plant looked fantastic. It was up and perky, and it was great. It was one little stem. So I was like, okay. So what I did, I cut my losses. Well, I cut that stem out. I didn't want to see anything starting. I went ahead and cut it, threw it in the woods. Got up, went to work the next day, didn't think anything about it. Came home that night, went on my nightly walk out to the garden. That plant, y'all, from top to bottom was dead. Dead, 100%. I mean, no coming back, no chance. It looked like it just, what had happened is something severed the ties that bring the water. So there's lines, for not getting too deep, there's lines that go up and down a plant, no matter what, that carry your water and your nutrients and that disperse it throughout the rest of the leaves and such. Well, when those lines get severed, no water is making it up to the top of the plant. So that plant quickly dies, especially on that day, which is about 105 real feel. So like I said, the whole plant in 100-degree weather was not getting, water was not being taken up. What do I have to do? Go out to the garden, jerk it up out of the ground, and I throw that thing in the woods, because I'm cutting my losses. I'm getting rid of it. I've got 11 really clean, good-looking tomatoes this year. I started with 12, but that's how it goes. It happens. It's part of it. So always, if you have the space, plant more than what you think, because you're going to see something down the road that will eventually get you. So like I said, cut your losses on them if you do see really diseased plants, and we really need to get a lot of that stuff out of there and keep it clean as much as you can. So there we go. I think we've caught up on tomatoes.
That sounds pretty catch-uppy to me. If you have any questions, if you're out there watching on Facebook or Zoom, just comment away. We'll stick around for another minute or two to answer those, and then we'll be on our merry way.
Sounds good. It's gonna be a hot one out there today, y'all. Good Lord, a bad heat index today. It's brutal walking out in that garden every night after working here all day. Good Lord, if you work outside, you know what I'm talking about. It's it'll wear you out for sure, but it's certainly worth going out and doing it. Tomato. Tyler, how are your tomatoes doing?
That's my middle name. They're doing well. They're in a raised bed right now. Okay. I'm about to stake them because they're starting to get really tall.
It's that time.
Yes, I do believe I planted Aroma, and then I think one other just kind of regular indeterminate variety. And I'm gonna have to get me really tall stake for that one. It's right next to a trellis that I have built that has some wire mesh. So I'm also thinking about maybe tying one off to that too, to kind of, free up the space in that little bed. It's only a 5x3 bed, so it's kind of small.
Yeah, pretty small for tomatoes.
Yeah, I did plant a seedless grape yesterday in this heat, in this afternoon heat, and it was absolutely sweltering. But
it's brutal. It's brutal on you. What it's not brutal on is the grape. They love it hot and dry, as much as you can give it.
Yeah, it's doing fine.
Yeah,
I don't think it even flinched.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not seeing any questions here on Zoom.
I must have answered them all.
I mean, you are kind of thorough.
We were thorough today. It was good.
Yep. And we do have nothing on Facebook, so I think we're good, man.
All right. Well, let's wrap it up. Once again, as always, y'all, we love talking to y'all about plants. It's what we do. It's what we love here at Bates, and we got professionals to help you out. So if you have issues, questions, tomatoes, pictures, something's not looking good, whatever's going on, bring them out to us. Let us help you. Let us find what you need, and keep tuning into these and keep learning all about plants. The more you grow, the more you know. So keep on growing stuff, and you will keep on learning just like I do every single day. I know there's no shortage of knowledge out there to be learned, and I just love learning about it every day, and hopefully helping y'all learn more too. So we appreciate it, and y'all have a great day.